Hi there, welcome everybody to Bookmark's session tonight. Uh, we've got Murray Armstrong tonight, who is a former associate editor of The Guardian and author of The Fight for Scottish Democracy, Rebellion and Reform in 1820, which was written in 2014, and now to discuss the book which came out last year, The Fight for Scottish Democracy, Rebellion and Reform in 1820. So I'm really excited to be hosting again tonight with Murray. We've been a duo before, so welcome to Murray. And my name is Julie Sherry, I should have said. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in Glasgow, and also leading anti-racist campaigner nationally. So tonight, as I said, we're delighted to have Murray joining us. I think, particularly when we look at some of the themes that are coming up around the question of rebellion and the people resisting and fighting back and looking at an important part of history both in Scotland and wider. Obviously at the moment that's a very pertinent question when we look at the world that we live in at the moment and the urgent need for change and to look where that might come from. So I'm very excited to hear from Murray. Murray's going to speak for probably just about half an hour. You can leave your comments in the chat thread. We're going to be bringing in some comments from the chat thread as after Murray's introduced, and Murray can hopefully come back on some of your questions there. And obviously, we want people to share ideas between themselves as well. So I'll hand over to Murray. Thanks so much.
Hi, thank you, Julie. I do have a little PowerPoint presentation for you as well, so that it's not just my old face on the screen while we're talking. Just to start off, the general strike and attempted insurrection in the west of Scotland during Easter 1820 was for democracy. It was the first known united action of the newly formed working class for a voice in government. It was the culmination of a 30-year-long campaign for parliamentary reform, which was interrupted for some of the time during the generation-long war with France. From the end of the war, there were 5 years of unsuccessful petitioning. During this time, the radicals had developed a formidable organization in the teeth of repressive legislation and military opposition. And they forged links with workers who had similar political objectives in the North and Midlands of England. For the first time, though, the whole of the emerging working class in Scotland, women and men, took collective action to defend and advance their own interests. Scotland's development was way behind England's, and its industrialisation was hurried. Its proletariat was quickly assembled compared with England. It came from a peasantry in the lowlands, the highlands, and Ireland. And Glasgow and the industrial towns of the West sprouted in a very, very short time. The country, Scotland, was still ruled by the remnants of a feudal regime. Compared with England, its middle class was small and still forming, and its democracy was next to zero. The 30 county and 15 borough parliamentary seats in Scotland represented an electorate of just 4,000 people, 0.2% of the population. There were more voters in Dublin than in all of the counties of Scotland. The vote in the towns and the cities was entirely in the hands of self-selecting borough councils. So the demand for representation in Scotland was really urgent and quite deeply felt. The condition of the working people, though, at the end of the French wars was desperate. The mass mobilization, the demobilization, of 400,000 men from the army and navy sent a tottering economy impoverished by war and economic blockade into a downward spiral. This was a headache for the government, not just because of the scale of unemployment, but because 1 in every 6 adult men was a battle-hardened veteran. The Tory-controlled aristocratic government refused to contemplate reform and answered the people's demands just with repression. They introduced new corn laws, which kept the price of bread artificially high to prop up the falling rents of landlords and the profits of farmers. Huge advances in industrial technology were driving social and economic changes that Lord Liverpool's Tory government of nobles, squires, bishops, and parsons could not even begin to comprehend. During the war, from 1812, when workers in the North and the Midlands of England began to defend themselves by breaking machines of those who worked at lower rates of pay, the reaction of the government was simply repression. The army that they posted in the northern counties was bigger than Wellington's army in Portugal and Spain. Then the government decided to solve the problem of machine breaking by making it punishable by death. Scottish textile workers rejected the tactic of machine breaking. In 1812, the Scottish weavers organised a national strike to stop the decline in their living standards. It was defeated in the end, and its leaders were jailed, but it succeeded in building an organisation that stretched all the way from Aberdeen to Carlisle. Weaving was the main occupation in Scotland. There were 60,000 looms in the country, half of them in the 5 western counties around Glasgow. The Scottish weavers had naively relied on an old law that gave magistrates the power to set wages. But the magistrates and the employers simply ignored the law, and by the beginning of 1813, the government in London abolished all of the statutes governing wage and price regulation, some of them dating back to the 16th century. This was a watershed moment for the free market followers of Adam Smith. Laissez-faire economics, the unregulated market of a growing industrial capitalism, was triumphant. So at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, a new mass campaign was begun for universal manhood suffrage and annual parliaments. Many of the activists were veterans of the Scottish Conventions for Democracy in 1792 and 1793 that was crushed by the Tory government of the time and ended with the conviction for sedition and transportation to Australia of Thomas Muir, William Skirving, and Thomas Palmer of the Scottish Friends of the People, and Joseph Gerald and Maurice Margaro of the London Corresponding Society. This new mass petitioning campaign took place throughout 1816 and 1817, accompanied by widespread meetings. Reform organisations called Hampden Clubs, or political unions, spread throughout Scotland and England. In October 1816, the biggest political meeting ever seen until that time in Scotland took place at Thrushgrove, a field just north of the Glasgow city boundary. More than 40,000 people attended, and the organisers, you can understand, were astounded. Reform petitions were presented to Parliament from every corner of the country up to the middle of 1817. The Scots were particularly active in gathering signatures, with more petitions per head sent to Westminster than from anywhere else in Britain. But each and every petition was rejected with contempt by the House of Commons. The period was also marked by extreme poverty, leading to bread riots, during which many local committees were established to campaign for poor relief. These committees overlapped with the reform clubs, and this led the government and its informers to suspect conspiracy and revolution in every appeal, even for the relief of distress. So on the 22nd of February 1817, in Glasgow, all 22 delegates at a reform committee meeting in a pub in Townhead were arrested and charged with high treason. But the government fumbled. The first prisoner to be tried appeared in court in Edinburgh in June, but the chief witness admitted that he had been offered bribes to give evidence, and all the cases collapsed. At the same time, England was in turmoil. Unemployed weavers began a march from Manchester to London to present reform petitions in person to the Prince Regent. They had rolled up blankets strapped to their backs, and they became known as the Blanketeers. But they were met with sabre-swinging cavalry and got no further than Macclesfield in Cheshire. One of them was shot dead. There were a number of unsuccessful risings in the manufacturing districts of England in that year. At Pentridge in Derbyshire, one attempted insurgency was led by a man called Jeremiah Brandreth. Brandreth and the other leaders were captured. He and 2 others were hanged and beheaded for treason at Derby in November, and 14 more were transported. Legal repression and military force, as you can imagine, dulled the appetite for reform for now, and this was complicated in 1818 by a typhus epidemic in Glasgow and much of the west of Scotland. It lasted until the middle of 1819 and took political activity to its lowest level for a number of years. But a new budget introduced by the government in June in 1819 raised taxes by £3 million. That was a fantastic sum of money at the time, and it was mainly on everyday goods like malt, spirits, tobacco, coffee, tea, and pepper. So there followed a huge resurgence of mass meetings right throughout Scotland and England during that hot summer of 1819, starting with 20 to 30,000 people gathering at Meikle Muir outside Paisley. And then on August 1819 at St. Peter's Field in Manchester, a reform meeting of 60,000, which was to be addressed by the famous orator Henry Hunt, was attacked by the local yeomanry and a troop of hussars, leaving 17 people dead and 650 or more injured. It quickly became known as Peterloo, an ironic reference to the final battle in the French wars at Waterloo in Belgium. The hussars in Manchester were all sporting their Waterloo medals at the time. The government and the Prince Regent praised the Manchester magistrates for the way that they had handled the mob. And so as news filtered through, the first post-Peterloo protest meetings in Scotland began to take place. They censured, and this is a quote, "the damnable doctrine of the divine right of kings, the obnoxious corn bill, the tax on tobacco, the bank bubble, the massacre at Manchester, and the shameful waste of money." At a meeting of about 18,000 people, again on Meikle Muir, just outside Paisley, the council banned banners and flags, but defiant marchers came through the town with their colours, this time edged in black for mourning for those people at Peterloo, and they paraded to the hustings. The hustings were also draped in black, and all the speakers dressed in mourning clothes. When a contingent from Glasgow marched back through Paisley on their way home, magistrates and constables tried to capture their banners. A riot broke out, and the people of Paisley and Glasgow fought with the police and the military on the streets of the two towns for 3 complete days. Protest meetings continued across Scotland during September and October, with 15,000 in Rutherglen, 7,000 in Kilmarnock, thousands more in Airdrie, Dumbarton, Ayr, Kilsyth, and Kirkintilloch. And for the first time, many came to these meetings armed. The middle classes in the towns and the landowners and farmers in the country were encouraged by the authorities to oppose reform by establishing troops of yeomanry cavalry and companies of armed militia. So a strategy of holding simultaneous armed mass meetings across both England and Scotland was organised by some of the more radical reformers. This was opposed by Henry Hunt, who had been arrested after the massacre in Manchester and was in jail in Lancaster Castle. He believed the reform movement now had the high moral ground. Most of the press, including the London Times, condemned the government's handling of Manchester. So Hunt believed that a combination of coroner's inquests and a public inquiry would inevitably lead to a successful motion for reform in Parliament. This was the first real public split in the reform campaign. However, Hunt didn't have the influence in Scotland that he had in England, and the Scots decided to go ahead with the first set of simultaneous meetings on the 1st of November 1819. Only one of them took place in England, and that was in London. Much of the army in Scotland, as well as the volunteer regiments, was moved to the Western Counties to meet the challenge, and Glasgow was surrounded. Even so, a mass meeting took place just outside Glasgow's city boundaries. It attracted 20 to 30,000 people. There were similar numbers in Paisley and other towns in the west of Scotland. General Bradford, the commander of the army in Scotland, wrote to his superior in London, "It is much to be feared that the country cannot be restored to tranquility without a serious and energetic action of the military against the mob." A second lot of follow-up meetings took place a fortnight later. But it's important to note that it was around this time that working class women began to play an active role in the struggle. Societies of female reformers, as they were called, had been formed in Lancashire just prior to Peterloo. Thousands upon thousands of women were now being employed in cotton mills. There were women on the platforms at most of the reform meetings from this time on. At Kilmarnock's November meeting, for example, the Society of Females in Waterside donated a collection of 16 shillings for the Manchester victims, a big sum for them. And their secretary told the meeting that it was, quote, "a crime to stand aloof after witnessing the indiscriminate butchery of age and sex on the inglorious field of Peterloo, a deed that makes my very blood run cold." Because women had been proportionately more likely than men to receive sabre wounds at Peterloo. The Manchester yeomanry were not only drunk and anti-reform, they scorned the men who demanded political equality, but they detested the women who dared to upset the traditional social order. The Peterloo protests spread such alarm throughout government that they recalled Parliament on the 23rd of November 1819. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, who was also the leader of the House, kept the MPs and peers sitting on their backsides from that moment until the 30th of December to push through the so-called 6 Acts. This banned meetings except by permission of a magistrate, outlawed weapons training or drilling, gave magistrates powers of search and arrest for possessing weapons, and that is a right which until then had been guaranteed under the Bill of Rights. They toughened the sedition and blasphemy laws, increasing sentences for printers, news vendors, journalists, authors, editors, and publishers to 14 years transportation. They increased the tax on cheap publications, effectively killing off the radical press, and they made bail more difficult. The passing of the 6 Acts meant that only those who were now prepared to meet and act in secret could function. Plans for further mass meetings in Scotland on the 30th of November were abandoned, apparently on the instructions of a radical central committee. But a strong chain of communication between local organisations in the west of Scotland now existed. A more fragile link was made with workers in England by sending delegates on the tramp. The underground organisation of the Radical Democrats was based on the secretive constitution of the Society of United Irishmen and the later Society of United Scotsmen at the end of the 18th century. It was so successful that the knowledge we have of the membership and activity of the radicals is very thin to this day. The first substantial evidence we have is from a government informer who described a central committee meeting on the 16th of December 1819, where a postponed December uprising was discussed. Apparently news of simultaneous rising in the north of England had not reached them by the agreed date in December, so everyone was stood down. But the committee reported that 10,000 could be quickly armed and prepared in Scotland, and that numbers would quickly reach 30,000 as the rising progressed. Of course, the supporters of reform, beyond the activists, was likely to have been in the hundreds of thousands. The Central Committee had, according to the informer's report, direct contact with radicals in the north of England and as far south as Nottingham. And the Manchester reformers had a delegate who regularly travelled south to Birmingham and London. Then we have a statement from a radical who was arrested later, who confirmed that the Central Committee met again on the 15th of January 1820, where 30 delegates voted for a strike on the 1st of March to last for several days to encourage insurrection. He reported that since the December committee meeting, great progress had been made in preparing themselves with arms, chiefly pikes, and that they had sent 2 envoys south, one to Manchester and one to Nottingham. On the government side, there were 2,000 regular soldiers in the west of Scotland, supplemented by the volunteer militias and armed associations. Regular searches were made for known radicals, arms and ammunition, and on the 22nd of February, once again, a 27-strong delegate committee meeting in Glasgow was arrested. They were all freed by early March because of insubstantial evidence to bring the proposed charge of sedition. But on the day after the delegates were arrested, news came from London that a group of direct action radicals had been arrested in Cato Street off the Edgware Road, where they planned to blow up the whole cabinet at a dinner in Grosvenor Square. The level of alarm was raised to the max, but for reasons still unknown to us, that 1st of March strike was called off. But on Easter Sunday, 2nd of April, the west of Scotland woke up to find posters in every town and village calling them to arms and to strike for universal suffrage and annual parliaments from Monday morning. The poster was signed by the Committee of Organisation for Forming a Provisional Government. The response was stunning. On Monday, 60,000 people downed tools. Foundries were occupied to make pike heads. The Lord Advocate of Scotland said this in a letter to Lord Sidmouth, the Home Secretary. Upon the Monday, the whole of the manufactories, with the exception of 1 or 2, were stopped, and I believe there was hardly a weaver who did not shut up his house and remain idle for a considerable time. The population of Glasgow assembled in the streets, where they formed themselves into columns and marched. The Tory supporting Glasgow Herald reported that it was not just weavers with downed tools. Colliers in the country round have likewise struck this morning, it said, and we have unfortunately to increase our list with the cotton spinners and some of the machine makers and founders. Oliver Jemison, who was the Provost of Paisley, wrote to Lord Provost Henry Monteith in Glasgow on the Monday morning. He said, "The working classes here are all idle and assembled in crowds on the streets. Several of the cotton mills began in the morning to work, but have struck since breakfast. Information has been received here that the movements of the disaffected are certainly to depend on the arrival or non-arrival of the mail tomorrow morning. If it does not arrive, they are to commence hostilities. If it does, they are to return to work." So if the London mail coach failed to turn up in Glasgow, that was the signal that the north of England had risen. But the mail coach did arrive on Tuesday, and the intelligence brought back from Nottingham by the delegates sent there was that Scotland had not to move until word arrived that 150,000 were under arms and had risen in the north of England. A small party was sent from Glasgow on Tuesday night in the pouring rain to collect arms and a piece of artillery from the Carron Ironworks. A young weaver from Townhead called Andrew Hardie, a veteran of the Berkshire militia, led them alongside John Baird, a former rifleman in the sharpshooters. John had fought in Portugal, South America, and in the Low Countries. Their mission was called off early on Wednesday morning, and they were instructed to wait in a field at Bonnymuir, near Falkirk, until dark and return to Glasgow. But they were discovered and attacked by a squad of hussars and yeomanry, who overpowered and captured 18 of them, including Hardie and Baird. This picture, by the way, which is a bit damaged, it's actually from a Glasgow Sogat banner. One of the young boys who was arrested and transported later was an apprentice bookbinder, and The Sogat branch remembered him on this, the painting that has been put on their banner. Meanwhile, in Glasgow, there were organised groups marching in the streets, and arms raids were taking place in private houses and out into the countryside. Weavers in the small town of Straven had downed their shuttles on Monday and began preparing pikes and ammunition. And when a messenger from the Central Committee reached them on Wednesday afternoon, told them to march to Cathkin-Braes the following morning and join the southern flank of a rebel army for an attack on Glasgow. They were told that the city was also to be attacked from the north by radical forces mustering on the Campsie Hills. The Straven radicals took control of their town on Wednesday and throughout the night raided houses and shops for arms and gunpowder. A fierce storm had raged all round the clock, and as one radical remembered later, although our number at one time amounted to nearly 100, by the time the sun rose on the morning of the 6th, we could scarcely muster 25. When they got there, Cathkin-Braes was deserted. A messenger from Rutherglen told them that the army was in control of Glasgow and arrests were already taking place. They hid their arms and fled. England had not been quiet, though. Attempted gatherings of insurgents had been taking place in Lancashire and Yorkshire over the Easter weekend. At one in Sheffield, 35 people were arrested after hundreds assembled at Grange Moor in Yorkshire, preparing an attack on Huddersfield. But the mail coaches kept coming, and defeatism spread throughout the west of Scotland by Thursday and Friday. The strike in Scotland, though, stayed solid for most of the week, but was abandoned by the weekend. Saturday the 8th of April in Greenock saw the last and bloodiest episode of the week, when 9 people were killed and 15 to 18 wounded. Paisley Jail was full, and magistrates asked a company of volunteers to escort 5 radical prisoners to empty cells in Greenock Jail. They marched into Greenock to the sound of their drums and fifes, with the prisoners in a cart in their midst, and this, you can imagine, drew large, angry crowds. The 5 captives were handed over at the jail, and as the soldiers turned to leave, stones and bottles were thrown at them. Their retreat was a running battle, and warning shots were fired over the head of the crowd. The Greenock crowd fought on, and some volunteers in the rear rank were ordered to turn and fire. Many fell on the spot, dead or wounded. A section of the protesters turned back to the jail and broke open the doors. The 5 radicals were freed and whisked out of town. They were never, ever caught. Throughout the west of Scotland, hundreds were rounded up by the army and hundreds more fled. In the end, a total of 98 men were indicted for high treason. 24 of them were convicted and sentenced to death. 52 of those named had escaped and fled. Those who absconded, said Scotland's Lord Advocate, were the chief leaders and instigators. Another 22 were acquitted for a lack of evidence, but only 3 were hanged and beheaded. They were Hardie and Baird, executed at Stirling, and 62-year-old Straven weaver James Wilson at Glasgow. Those 3 had played relatively minor parts in the insurrection. They were scapegoats. They were a warning to others that rebellion would not be tolerated. The rest of those in custody who were found guilty were transported to the penal colony in Sydney Cove. In England, the 25 men who were arrested and charged for the near simultaneous uprising at Grange Moor appeared at a special assizes in York a week after Hardie and Baird were executed. Desperate to avoid creating more martyrs, the Crown offered clemency if they all pled guilty. This they did, and they were all transported. The Glasgow Central Committee, though, still very much intact, wrote to their comrades in Manchester on the 18th of April. It was useless for us to persevere unless England would have stepped forward with a helping hand. We are compelled to submit on account of the military who seem to have an unlicensed authority to do anything they may think proper. Until we hear from you, until something further is executed on your part, we shall remain dormant. We remain yours in bonds of union and liberty. In December 1820, a meeting of several thousand respectable Whigs, mostly lawyers, bankers, and merchants, took place in Edinburgh. These were the moderate reformers who had deserted the working class movement long before the defeat of April. And now they raised the cry of reform, but they blamed the failure of the workers' movement on spies organised and deployed by a Tory government. That there were spies and agents and informers is incontrovertible. In 1816, a former leader of the Scottish Weavers, Alexander Richmond, this is him, was exposed as an infiltrator for the authorities and the radical committees in and around Glasgow. The biggest news story of 1817 was the unmasking in the north of England of a spy named William Oliver. There were others, but to talk of a system of spies at the time is a gross exaggeration. The Home Office was only the Home Secretary, Lord Sidmouth, his assistant, and a couple of clerks. It was not the great state machine we know today. These spies were amateur volunteers, men who offered their services for payment and often exaggerated their reports to guarantee more work. The government basically depended for its intelligence on magistrates, squires, parsons, and local military commanders, and very often they had no idea of what was going on in working class districts. And so they engaged those who were willing to snoop whenever and wherever they could, but it was hardly an organised secret service. The few spies to have fly-posted the whole of the west of Scotland and organised a general strike is scarcely credible. The Glasgow Chronicle concluded at the time, the whole manufacturing population of the Western District were prepared through their committees for the publication of the 1st of April, and they acted upon it accordingly. The simultaneous movements of that time could never have been affected by a system of espionage. 13 years later, after the first Reform Act had been passed and a Whig government was sitting in London, the Glasgow journalist and campaigner Peter Mackenzie cemented the idea of a vast government conspiracy in his 1833 book, An Exposure of the Spy System. He wanted to defend the reputations of moderate reformers from, quote, the stain that was unjustly put upon them in 1819 and 20. We are thoroughly convinced that Andrew Hardie and his unfortunate companions were the victims of bloodthirsty scoundrels better known by the name of spies, who at that time infested this country to the everlasting disgrace of its then government, by whom they were encouraged and protected. The few people who could be identified as leaders of the rebellion were named by Mackenzie as spies, with only circumstantial evidence to back his claims. Mackenzie had sown a myth that was taken up by subsequent writers looking for an excuse for the failure of the first working class revolt. In the later 1830s and 40s, the Chartist movement was divided on the issue, with the moral and physical force advocates taking on different narratives. The moral force champions had warned the movement, beware of spies. An independent Labour Party pamphlet, Fighters for Freedom in Scotland, written by Willie Stewart and published in 1908, took the myth into the 20th century. He claimed that, quote, the agents provocateurs of the government organised a sham rebellion and managed to give it so much the appearance of actuality that many of the genuine reformers were induced to take part. This view continued in 1920 by Tom Johnson in his otherwise remarkable History of the Working Classes in Scotland. But in 1968, as a new nationalism was taking root in Scotland, a pamphlet, The Rising of 1820, by Scottish National Party member Frank Sherry, with a foreword by the SNP MP Winnie Ewing, repeated the myth and added a new one, that the rising was nationalist as well as radical. This interpretation was taken up in 1970 in the only book-length treatment of the events so far, The Scottish Insurrection of 1820 by Peter Beresford Ellis and Seamus McAgovan. As well as repeating the conspiracy of spies, they asserted that its purpose was to encourage untimely rebellion, to flush out the leaders and prevent a rising for a Scottish republic. Beresford Ellis and McAgovan's book is well researched, but it doesn't reveal the origin of its sources. They have no footnotes or references. The book was received with mixed, generally unfavourable reviews because of this, but also because it tried to shoehorn the early radicalism into a nationalist box. The overwhelming evidence remains that the pivotal focus of the radical organisations was for a reform of representation in the House of Commons. Of course, there were enthusiastic expressions of attachment to national identity through songs and symbols and heroes and history, but that did not amount to a campaign for independence. The strike and attempted insurrection were self-conscious acts of working people for the good of all. The attempt to explain its failure by the intervention of government spies takes away all the independent agency from those people who fought for a better future. The ideas of the first working class movement for radical change were rooted in an internationalism derived from the Enlightenment thought that powered the American and French revolutions. They were ideas that brought change and resistance all over Europe during that revolutionary time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Murray. That was absolutely fantastic. And I'm sure everybody watching live and also all the people that are going to watch live afterwards as well are, really going to get an awful lot out of that really fascinating, explanation of that period of history. So we've got some comments in the chat thread, so I'm going to feed in some of those, and then I might get you to come back in and answer some of those for us, Murray. And then I think we'll, maybe have a few more rounds of questions. So I would encourage everybody watching, please do post any questions or comments that you have into the chat thread, and we will, we will feed them into the meeting so that you can have Murray answer your questions for you. So first of all, we've got Hector P. Sierra says, hi from Glasgow. Listening to Murray is always interesting and informing, so I'm sure Murray's happy to hear that. Tim Evans had the question, was the radical network linked to this corresponding societies? We have a comment from Martin Jones who says, I think Murray touched upon this, some of this after Martin had left the comment. The attempted uprising in the Huddersfield area petered out without the same impact as in Scotland. Is there any evidence of direct links? Was there communication in different areas? And was this an opportunity for spies? And Dave Sherry says, sorry, I'm just getting a comment there. Seem to have lost it. 2 comments there. In the 1740s, a third of Scotland's population lived north of the Highland Line. The rapid, belated rate of Scottish urbanisation and industrialisation that followed the Battle of Culloden was unprecedented in Europe. Combined and uneven development, Scotland's great leap forward was most acute in the Clyde Valley and was the material basis for the insurrectionary events that Murray is describing. And so, I might bring you in, Murray, if you want to comment on some of those questions and comments. Yeah. That's all.
Yeah. Was the network linked to the corresponding societies? Well, no, the corresponding societies had gone by then. The corresponding societies were set up in 1792. They were the first kind of plebeian, if you like, societies. The working class was just forming at the time. So there were small shopkeepers, cobblers, and other people. There was no kind of identification as a working class at the time. But they set their organisations up. It was based in London, but it was very, very strong in Norwich and Manchester and Bristol and other places. And they set it up on the basis that membership would be unlimited, and the subs were a penny a week, which was affordable for most ordinary people at the time. Unlike the other reform organisations, peopled by the rich Whigs at the time, who had membership fees of tens of guineas a year, which working class people just could not afford. But after when the French wars broke out in 1793, and the leaders of the London Corresponding Society were all had up for high treason. They were tried, but London juries, unlike the juries in Scotland that were handpicked by the judges, London juries acquitted all of them. But the repressive legislation throughout the French wars meant that the corresponding societies had withered on the vine. It was the new reform societies after the war, the Hampden clubs and the political unions, that took their place. These were national organizations, even although a national organization, funnily enough, at this time, it was still illegal to belong to a national organization. But they had a network right throughout England and Scotland, based around the petitioning campaigns. And it was quite a strong network. And so with the attempted risings over the Easter weekend in England, and you ask, it was the direct links with Huddersfield. Whether there was a direct link with those particular workers in Huddersfield, we can't know. I mean, the organizations were so secretive. People were used to secretive organizations at the time because of the Combination Acts. Even, being a member of a union, you had to be secretive. You had to swear oaths that were akin to kind of Masonic oaths. They had handshakes and symbols and all sorts of things to recognize each other, and great awful oaths of death and destruction if you gave any of your comrades away. So whether there was a direct link between Scotland and Huddersfield, we don't really know. We know that there were links between the organisations throughout the north of England, throughout the north and Midlands of England, and between the Midlands and London. But there was no national organisation as such. And we also know that the Scottish organisation, which was considerably stronger just because of the nature of the composition of the population in Scotland. We know that they had direct links with Manchester and Nottingham, and were keen to develop the links. But we can't know much more because they were very successful in building their secret organisations. And Dave's comment about combined and uneven development, this is the clue to the strength of the movement in Scotland and why that's the place, the west of Scotland in particular, where industrialisation was intense and urbanisation was intense, and the poverty that went with urbanisation and the collective necessity that went with industrialisation to defend wages, conditions, lifestyle in general was so important. It's that uneven and combined development. There's a fantastic essay in the latest edition of the Scottish Labour History Society that's dealing with combined and uneven development. It's written by Neil Davidson and I can't remember his partners now. Two of them. Sorry, partner, if you're listening, I can't remember your name. But that's a fantastic essay. It's the first part of a huge two-part work that they were doing. Dave Neil, unfortunately, died while this was in progress, this work. But they make the argument that this combined, that Scottish general strike was the harbinger of things to come as industrial capitalism spread throughout the world in an uneven and combined way, when new industrial classes in different nations and regions were very quickly put together and had to, and very quickly develop a sense of class identity. So I think, although I haven't gone into it, I think that the idea of that combined and uneven development is a very important one to try and understand just the pace of events at the time, and to try and understand our history as well.
Thanks, Murray. Yeah, you can. It's so fascinating just to listen to talk about it. I keep forgetting I'm about to come back on the screen. But we have a few more questions as well. I mean, one of the questions that I had sort of flows on a little bit from what you were just ending on there about the question of the combined and uneven development. And I think, I suppose my question is about how much at the time was the rebellion tied in an international context. I mean, you touched on this a little bit, but of course, it's a quite interesting point in the development of capitalism, and you have this whole sense of ideas being thrown up in the air, the ideas of the Enlightenment breaking through, the question of being in the wake of the French Revolution, and particularly as well, some of the ideas around women. I thought it was quite interesting in this talk and in others. You mentioned, the sort of the influx of women into the working class, and the role then that they're playing within that struggle. And also we're sort of looking at a period that's, sort of in the wake of the ideas of Mary Wollstonecraft, also the role that women played inside the French Revolution. And I wonder, I suppose you answered it a little bit there, but the question of combined and uneven development, and was this kind of shift that took place to lead to these struggles now, why did that sort of specifically happen in Scotland at this time? And I think some of what you touched upon there answered that. And I think, I think also obviously we're in the week now where we're seeing a whole explosion right now over the question of Kill the Bill, which I think in some ways actually relates to this meeting in a number of ways. I mean, we were just talking there about, the influx of women into the working class alongside men, and perhaps a shift to, point in history where there's some kind of collective power there when they can take action together. And I think some of the answers about how we get rid of, the deeply sexist society we lie in also lie in the lessons of these struggles from history, where we see working class people really fighting back. But also, the question of the crime bill and so on that's been brought in, that the Tories are trying to push through, and the question of the role of the state in trying to crush down on any sense of kind of rebellion or criticism. So I wondered if you had any links to feed in there about the question of, the state and the repression of the rebellion, and what lessons there are from the struggle that we're looking at for how we fight in a very oppressive and exploitative system today. And a couple of more comments from the thread. A couple of people have said, great talk. Martin Jones said, very interesting, can't wait to read the book. Someone else has said it's a really interesting talk on mass struggles that I was unfamiliar with, and a lot of people are making those kind of comments. So I guess that was one of my questions as well, is why it's relatively little known in history, and why do they not teach us about this struggle, both sort of in our schools and in our universities, but also do you think there's a reason why this is one of the little or known periods of struggle, given how fascinating it is? And I think that might have been all my questions. Oh, one final question. So it's a comment in the chat. Murray has also written a great book in 2014 about Scotland in the wake of the French Revolution. It's called The Liberty Tree, the story of Thomas Muir and Scotland's first fight for democracy. Have these great events that Murray brings to life so far had much significance for the independence movement of today. So that, I mean, you answered this a little bit, but earlier on with the sort of attempts to display the struggle as one that was about nationalism. But maybe you could comment a little bit further on that in a broader sense of the comment, the nature of what's happening in Scotland and Britain today and how these struggles relate.
On the international side of things, of course, the whole thing was driven by those new ideas at the time. Oh, excuse me, I've got a message saying my Mac's going to shut down. Hang on. There we go, we're plugged in. Yeah, those new ideas at the time, ideas of liberty, ideas of democracy, coming from the Enlightenment, particularly the Scottish Enlightenment. And the Scottish Enlightenment, the sort of idea of Presbyterian democracy and the right, that in Presbyterian theology, it was the right of people to reject the contract between the ruler and the ruled if the rulers did not carry out their function. This is an essential part of that kind of Enlightenment Presbyterian theology. And that's what powered a lot of the thinking in the American Revolution. Of course, there was different context, but similar in the French Revolution. And it's interesting when you read the speeches of people, that big 40,000 strong meeting in Glasgow in 1816, when all these kind of small shopkeepers and artisans and things got up to speak at it, they all talked about France. They talked about America, not just their revolutions, but they talked about the dreadful wars against these people by our government, the dreadful wars against the people of India in order to set up empire. After the Peterloo massacre, shortly after the Peterloo massacre, one of the heirs to the throne in France was assassinated, and there were riots accompanying the assassination. And one of the calls heard during the riots that this was pour nos frères in Manchester. This is for our brothers in Manchester. So that whole idea, although it wasn't practically impossible to make physical contact in different countries, and I suppose the sort of cultural differences at the time would have felt much wider than we feel them, and so the links between the direct links between these countries are not quite so obvious, but definitely the intellectual international ideas were there. The question of women coming into the struggle in a big way is quite important. It's not that women weren't in the struggle before, but in a domestic economy, women actually, especially as urbanization was taking place, women were in control of the streets where they lived. I mean, these were the people that organized locally and socially. The riots against soup kitchens that people felt insulted by in the East End of Glasgow and the Carlton were organized by women at the time. But it was the influx of women into the factories that made the material change. Before that, radicalism and feminism were investigating much deeper problems than just the vote. I mean, women like Mary Wollstonecraft and the other feminist writers at the time were interested in independence from men, legal independence from men. They wanted to be able to own property just like men did. They didn't want to have to give whatever property they had to their husband as soon as they got married. The husband had complete control of children. They wanted equal education, but it was the legal position of women was very, very definitely subordinate at the time, and early feminists were more concerned with trying to overcome that legal subordination, and so it didn't really constantly. Although lots of them said that women should have equal political rights, but their main focus was not on the political sphere. But as women come into the factories and are organized in the factories, then the political demands that men had been making, I mean, it was manhood, universal manhood suffrage that was the big question at the time. But this was still kind of supported by women at the time, because they saw it as not a man's vote, but a household vote. This becomes, later in the labour movement, this becomes a real problem, the notion of the household, because later on, when the trade union movements when the trade unions are stronger, when women were beginning to be seen by some unions as undercutting men's wages, and the whole idea that these working class women should become like the aristocratic women and spend their times at home and look after the home and look after the children. This split the trade. This whole idea split the trade union movement right down the middle for years and years, right into the 1950s. It split the trade union movement. So the question of the political mirror of that was, do we want universal suffrage or kind of household suffrage in the thing? So that wasn't a question that had been fully explored by this time, and so the idea of manhood universal suffrage in 1820 didn't really seem quite as misogynistic as we might think today. Why is this whole section of our history buried? Well, it's dynamite. That's really why it's buried. It's also been written off by many academic historians in the past as being not really important, a little hiccup, a footnote in the history of forward development, of things getting better and better day by day, and that's really why it was buried. It was never forgotten. It was always there amongst ordinary working people. During the great demonstrations in Edinburgh and Glasgow, when the 1832 Reform Bill was passed, then there were banners with Muir and Skirving and Palmer and Marlborough and Gerald on their banners. There were banners commemorating Andrew Hardie, John Baird, and James Wilson, the ones who were executed. So they were always there. There were societies. I mean, even although the Independent Labour Party saw the whole thing as being the work of spies, they were still sympathetic to the people that took part in the thing, and they kind of kept the memory alive. And they were the ones who made sure that the annual commemorations took place, that monuments were put up to these people, to some of them anyway. And this was carried on by the early Labour Party, but then it was taken over by the radical nationalists. not that it was taken over, just that it got kind of forgotten by the Labour Party later on. But the radical nationalists were prepared to take it on. And the 1820 Society was set up to make sure that that struggle was remembered. So it has been kept. It's buried, but it has been kept alive by ordinary people. And I think it's the radical wing of today's independence movement in Scotland that remembers them as possibly we would like them to be remembered, not as an early struggle for nationalism or for a Scottish republic, but it was just a radical period, and it was unique at the time to Scotland and to the Scottish working class, and it serves to inform the modern radical movement. My book, there was another two books you saw just at the end there in the PowerPoint presentation, another two books published in April 2020 to commemorate the 200th anniversary, one by Kenny McCaskill and one by Maggie Craig. And all three of those books take the same line, that it wasn't a thing that was organized by spies, and it wasn't a thing that was calling for Scottish independence.
Thanks.
Have I missed something?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there was a question that's come in since, which I thought you might want to reflect on, but I can't find it now, unfortunately. So instead, I'll end with this one, which is, just I suppose, because we're coming to the end of the meeting now, and the time that we've got to host it, but people are posting in a lot of comments about how much they've enjoyed it. I think people should definitely get the book. Of course, you can get it. I'm sure Dave is posting the link into the chat for all those watching the meeting to click and get the book, to get the other books that Murray mentioned, and to have a look at the bookshop in general. We do also have an upcoming book, which you can't quite get yet, but we'd like to give a little plug for, which is a collection of essays and different authors writing around different themes, around breaking up the British state, Scotland, independence, and the fight for socialism. So that will be an interesting one, and also has chapters that touch upon the period that Murray, his meeting has covered today, but also across sort of the history of Scotland. So it should be an interesting one. So I guess, just to end the meeting, I mean, Murray, what do you think of this, fantastic, incredible, inspiring, I think your word was, a history that is dynamite, and that's why the state don't really want to educate us on it, and why it's a bit of a hidden history for people. What do you think that do you think that there was the historical possibility at the time for this struggle to have been successful? And if so, what were the kind of factors that you think were involved in that, and what would have, how would that have looked? And secondly, what do you think the kind of, I suppose to sum up on this question, what do you think the key take-home lesson about this piece of history and understanding it today is for us in the fight for a better world now?
The kind of what if question is a difficult one. Could it have worked? Could it have been successful? Well, they certainly had the organisation to make it successful. They didn't have the guns that the mighty military state, imperial state, had put together. And the other problem was that, unlike in France or America, they were deserted by the newly forming middle class. There was no middle class. Unlike the French Revolution was pushed forward by the people, but the middle class were involved in it. There was Robespierre, there was Danton, there were all of those representing the kind of the middle class that wanted change. The middle class in Scotland really was clinging to the coattails of the middle class in England and wanted to be just like them, and support a government that would maybe advance their interests in a completely different way by allowing them to become rich merchants and buy pieces of land and have stately homes all by themselves. So I think that the class structure at the time was against it, and in some ways was for it, because the working class was powerful, but maybe just not powerful enough at the time. The takeaway lessons, as usual, it's organization, isn't it? The little snippets of the kind of organization that they had at the time are quite informative. That things just don't happen on their own. You have to make them happen, that we make our own world. But the other takeaway lesson, I suppose, is, look, people before us have tried it. They failed, but they wanted to build a better world for us. And we've got the same responsibility for future generations.
It's a very kind of beautiful, hopeful thought to end the meeting on tonight. So thanks, Murray. And I think, increasingly as we look around us with the scale of what's happening with the pandemic, we're still in lockdown. The sort of racism and sexism and the exploitation that exists in the world that we live in is obviously something that drives us all to want to resist. But I think at the same time, we do have a lot to be hopeful about with that message that Murray ended on, because we see big movements on the streets, organising themselves to be as safe as possible, but fighting back for a better world. So there is an enormous hope, and I think Murray's absolutely right. We do have the responsibility to be organised and to educate ourselves about the lessons from history. So do buy the book, do visit Bookmarks, and stay safe and stay socialist, everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for everybody for the lovely comments, and thanks to Bookmarks.